Wait, hold on. Do you have tarot cards near you?
Why, yes, I do. Yes.
Okay, I actually would love to start. Would you want to pull a card for this conversation?
Sure. Yeah. And let me just tune in for a minute.
Yeah.
I did tune in earlier. Actually, my altar is totally activated. I had a feeling that the cards might make an appearance. So let me just take a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful Queen of Wands. Let's see here. Okay, sure. I will pull a card for this conversation.
Was that the queen that popped?
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
I know. Love to see her show up.
I'm going to try to recount back to you. So if anyone's listening while you're shuffling and they're not familiar with your work and your tarot practice, from my recollection, and also from going through your tarot workshop, by the way, which is where I got reconnected with our mutual friend, Julianne Combus. Yeah, so you wait, a tarot reading doesn't begin until one of the queens pops or in some way shows up, correct?
Right. That is my practice, and that is the way my mother taught me, and it is the way that I approach it. So we kind of see the four queens as the four gateways into the flux or the divinatory field, that space where divination happens, where a lot of things happen. Divination is one of the things that can happen in that space. And so each of the four queens in the tarot in my tradition has a liturgical correspondent to one of the versions of the Christian Mary image, radically kind of reinterpreted, I should add.
Sure.
So yeah, we get permission from one of the queens to enter the flux, and she kind of, depending on what queen shows up, you get a sense of what the energy is going to be like. So
and so what does the Queen of Wands showing up say?
Well, the Queen of Wands is she's the mother of divination. She holds the magic wand, so she understands the sacred technology of allowing the flux to gather and focus and to be a signal that can be boosted outward. She is also that pivot zone between surviving and thriving. She's all about transformation and trans technologies. So she's amazing, and she's sexy. She's a sexy queen, So she kind of said, yes, enter. And then the cards that came up regarding this conversation. Well, first we have one of her messengers, the Knight of Wands. And in my tradition, the knights are always messengers, so they always mean another card has to pop. And so in this case, this is the card that pops. So this is the message that's being amplified. And there's a sense of kind of urgency associated with the Knight of Wands. And it's interesting because the Knight of Wands has been coming up quite a lot. And I find that when we approach new years, new cycles, that a lot of messages will have this type of animation around it. And so this is
that other card.
Yeah, so this is interesting. In my tradition, this is one of the cards that is known as one of the poverty paradigm cards. And when this card comes up, it's the Six of Pentacles and the conventional Rider-Waite.
Yep. Okay.
And when this card comes up, one of the things that it does is it asks us to get a mantra kind of like on repeat in our system, and our systems plural. And the mantra in this case is, I will not ally with any person, belief system, institution, individual dynamic that would require me to diminish myself or to dim my light. And so it's kind of allowing that sentiment to kind of collect as a mantra that you want to kind of just like put on repeat in your nervous system. And so, and I think that, this is something that's been coming up with a lot of my community divination work. This idea as we go into a new year, into a new cycle, um, to look at those places that require or request us to be diminished,
Mm.
and to move into places of liberation if we're able to, around those dynamics.
Yeah. I want to respond to that, but I just got a low battery warning on my computer. Give me 1 second
Okay. Yeah,
while I fix that.
I know technology.
Okay, you there?
Yeah.
All right. Knew that was going to happen at some point. I lost a connector, so I can it's like I only have so many outlets in my computer. So I'm making
Right.
choices. But yeah, that feels super fitting, I feel like, for this conversation. And I mean, I know that writers are wont to provide metaphor to anything. um,
Right.
but yeah, that feels super fitting, I think, for me, not just, I mean, I think the diminishing part is so interesting because, or like not diminishing any part of who you are. I think where I was going to start actually was I was looking back through um, uh, divinatory poetic stuff of yours, your book. And of course, you've already been quoted a lot in my conversation with Serena Chopra, but I saw again, there's a couple quotes that I thought were really interesting to start this conversation with. And one was, the crossroads is the zone of the divinatory. And then another one by Camille Roy, that narrative or stories provide context so that the rupturing of identity is recognizable.
Mm.
And to me, I feel like it's that quote, I think in particular about the rupturing of identity, says so much to me about why I think I do this podcast. I've said multiple times that for me, this started out sort of just like as an artistic practice. It was something that I've always been really interested in, is mashing together seemingly disparate things. But I think what I've started to really see is like how much I've gone through rupture of my own story,
Mm-hmm.
and in that sort of shattering of identity, and the way that story really helps contextualize that, and writing for me helps contextualize that. There's everything from, I think, Christianity and queerness,
Mm-hmm.
like coming out was a severe rupturing of identity for me. And what did it mean to be both a person of faith and a queer person at the time?
Mm-hmm.
I think in my mid 20s. And then, um, everything from, there was a period of time where I was a vegetarian for several years, and then I decided to start eating meat again. And that was a massive rupture of identity. That almost
Mm-hmm.
felt more severe than
Mm-hmm.
disentangling Christianity and queerness in some ways. I think even, yeah, the ways that I've grappled with queer and organizing culture, and I've talked about that a lot, and what it meant to sort of step away from organizing culture and sort of find myself. Like there's just been, I think, any number of what have been pretty dramatic ruptures of my own story, and having to go, wait, what if I'm all of these things? And how do you hold all of that? And again, I think that quote, that narrative or stories providing context so that the rupturing of identity is recognizable. And I think even, some of what Serena and I talked about, how stories are rhizomatic. Like it's not been a clean story for me. There's no way to like really cleanly integrate all of those things. But there is something, I think, for me in doing this, that's been my own way of practicing holding nuance and not diminishing any part of who I am in order to be any one of those identities, right? So like, what does it now mean as a 40-year-old person for me to go, wait, what if I did all that disentangling around faith stuff in order to like sort of really fully embrace my queerness, and then I went, wait, what if all of the faith stuff isn't gone? Like I don't think it ever was, but how, like that's sort of a rupture too. Like how do I even talk about that?
Mm.
to people who now like largely around me in very justifiable ways are like, oh, we don't do that. It's like not part of our life anymore. And I'm like, oh man, how do I, yeah, there's just so many ways I could go on forever about, but I think that's a relevant message and a card pull for a conversation like this for sure.
Absolutely. And there was so much richness in all that you just said. So many stories in the one story, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ways that we arrive into our multivalence. Um, really, so many important things that came up there. The idea of the crossroads,
Mm-hmm.
which is a place of surrender and sacred relinquishment. You know, letting go of what we thought or what we hoped or what we believed we knew, and asking for a new point of view, crafting a poignant relationship with uncertainty rather than numbing out or shutting down,
Yeah, absolutely.
so
It requires a
yeah.
massive amount of engaging with discomfort and
Mm.
yeah, not it feels like it would be very easy, I guess, to check out in a lot of ways. But I think
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm just that kind of person, if I just like can't sort of sustain a numbed out existence or what. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, it feels like a constant practice of uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, I was just reflecting earlier this morning on something, and I was thinking, the diviner's prayer is, may my loved ones always be on the fortuitous side of the disaster.
Mm,
We could sub in the word like rupture,
mm-hmm.
the idea of rupturing of identity. May I be on the fortuitous side of it. Whatever that may mean. It's not about preventing it or resolving it or solving it, but about creating a relationship with it, um, that is, rooted in consciousness and wakefulness and filterless engagement rather than shutting down or numbing out, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, I would love to ask something that I often ask at the beginning of these conversations, which is, are there any seeming contradictions or ruptures you feel like you're holding right now, like that are really specifically present?
I mean, I think so. I think being a femme identified queer body, in this moment, I'm a person who, is that type of body, and that's going to line me up, calibrate me to a multiplicity of paradoxes. And I think also, my medium is writing, my medium is the divinatory flux.
Mm-hmm.
And the medium of, for example, of writing is unstable. It resists closure. It doesn't seek to arrive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's, so I guess, thinking about that, the medium of language, is deeply rooted in the heart of paradox. Um, so there's that piece too. So it just feels like to exist is to engage with the paradox of, of having a body and being at these various junctures.
Yeah.
It's unavoidable. It is the condition.
It is, right. It is the
Uh-huh.
condition.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's quick anecdote. I mean, I remember listening. I guess I got really interested in science a few years ago, and I did a bunch of writing where I was like really sort of digging into the work of folks who were working in quantum physics, because quantum physics is just endlessly poetic and fascinating to me. And a lot of that story was about quantum physicists trying to resolve the seeming contradiction at the heart of physics, which is quantum gravity and general relativity. And forgive me if I'm saying that wrong, scientists. That's the best I can remember. But regardless, I at some point just started doing a bunch of this writing where I was like, I think you've found the truth, which is that it's all a contradiction. That two seemingly opposing things can exist at the same time and still be true. But I
Mhm.
also, I did all this and before I started getting back into doing my own writing and doing this podcast, I have these friends who are really into um, like personality testing, like Myers-Briggs sorts of things. And they were sort of going, okay, helping me sift through like, Brandi, what do you really want to do? And what's exciting to you? And, most of the time I'm like, I would really rather just spend a lifetime reading. I don't know what else. Like, that sounds like fun to me. And, they were like, would you ever feel satisfied if you didn't ever share what you learned from that reading? And I was like, no, I don't think so, because that would feel like hoarding a gift. If I got insights from the reading, but also that there was something. Where was I going with that? Hold on, give me a second. Getting older, this brain of mine. Myers-Briggs question. Oh, that like, I think at some point, like I was trying to decipher whether or not I wanted to do coaching in some way, because I had started this business that was mostly in branding and marketing coaching. But then I was sort of getting into like, what a lot of folks are getting into, which is like life coaching and that sort of thing. And I was like, I don't know if that's really what I want to do. Cause I really, actually, what's so funny is that there was, I don't think I've ever been able to communicate this to you, but there was a week I woke up, I was sleeping and I was in like a liminal state. And this is where I knew it was like something divine, or like whatever you want to call that magic thing where you get something that's said to you that's like really clear. And for one, I remember in some of your divination workshop stuff that you were talking about how it was sort of like how intuition feels. And it's not like, intuition often isn't like judgmental, like you're not like sort of beating yourself up. It's more like a neutral thing that just sort of appears for you and is not super emotional necessarily. But and so I was in this liminal state. I wake up and I hear the words, I don't want to give people answers, I want to ask people questions. And this was like as I was like working on doing the coaching business stuff. And I was like, well, that says something to me. And I think within a week or two, I started your divination workshop where I reconnected with Julianne. And I think at the very beginning in the like intro session, you say something like, divination is not about giving people questions or answers, it's about asking questions. And I was like, oh shit. That's not only like accurate, it's like literally word for word what I had heard said to me from whatever magical realm. And so when my friends and I were talking about what I wanted to do, they were like, Brandi, isn't your writing sort of giving people the answer? I was like, no, you don't understand. Like, the writing is just me expressing a question. Like, every time I write, it's just me asking a question. And even in doing this podcast, I think that this is me just grappling with other people in the question. I don't think anytime I state an opinion, I actually fully believe it necessarily. I feel like it should come with this like undergirding sentiment, which is, I actually don't know, but here's what I'm experiencing now, and maybe that will change later. So yeah, I find that about writing also, that it's not really an answer so much as it is a question, that it is a constant paradox.
Absolutely. I love so much of what you just shared. I believe in the question as a mode, as a posture, as a way to orient towards all that is. And in reading, I love, when you were talking about you loved, reading and sharing that reading, how reading brings us into community, how community is an alchemical chamber where we can ask the question and the question can do its work on the collective nervous system. And yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of divination, and in terms of writing, right, it isn't about fixed outcomes. It is about knowing, or uncovering poignant strategies to relate to uncertainty. It's about not answering the question, but allowing the conditions to call forth a more evolved or more cultivated iteration, perhaps, of that existing question. It's about what's the next best question,
Yeah, Absolutely. Um, yeah, one of my favorite writers also said at some point, like magic is just attending to the next right thing that wants to happen,
Mm,
which I love. But for anyone who might be listening and is like, what do they mean by divining? I'm
mhm.
assuming that what we've just talked about, like the question as a posture, is one of its animating principles. But could you
Mhm.
describe what divining is for you, which I'm sure could be book after book after book, and
Yeah, I'll
whatever
try to do
comes
the
to you now.
nutshell version.
Yeah, and yeah,
Mhm.
what maybe some of those animating principles of divining are for you.
Thank you, Brandy, for that question. And I will do my very best to give the nutshell version. And beginning with the caveat that this is just my experience of divination.
Yeah.
There are many experiences of divination, and so this is just mine. Um, and so that is important to acknowledge and to say. But in my experience of divination and the way that I was taught divination, I really see divination as one of the prayer technologies.
Mm,
It is a place where we engage with the benevolent invisible in order to, again, this idea of cultivating a poignant relationship with uncertainty. Divination is a place where we speak and where we receive. It's a place that shows us where we're out of alignment with our soul's contract with this incarnation, that we might come into alignment. And at the end of the day, it's always rooted in liberation based strategies.
mm,
And so that is some kind of just some fundamental notions that animate divination. And so divination is, I work with a deck of cards, and but a lot of times I'm just holding the deck. It's the oracle is part of the process, right?
mm.
um
Right, like it's
but
an
it's really about a
active
type of
participant.
openness. Yes, it's an
Right.
engagement.
Yeah.
It's a type of engagement.
Mm. Yeah, I love one of my favorite quotes from the beginning of your book, Divinatory Poetics, is becoming a reader includes entering the stream. Risk and disorientation are part of the price of admission. And on this matter, there is no negotiation.
That's been my experience.
Yeah, I mean that's really what we've talked
Uh-huh.
about so far, right? That
Right.
like the act of being alive really is just a
Hmm.
contradiction, a constant question, a constant paradox. You're
Hmm.
disoriented. There's not really a lot of feeling grounded. In fact, in Buddhism, you're often talking about groundlessness, and
Hmm.
that's sort of the posture that you're meant to get comfortable with.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, which is interesting because well, first of all, I would love for you to also tell how did you get into divination? Because you come from a lineage of diviners, right? And um, yeah, and then I guess I'll go from there. But I would love to hear that story first.
Well, just briefly, eh, divination was something that I grew up around. My mother read cards and was a huge influence. And there were members in my community who read cards. I had an aunt in particular, my Aunt Penny, an incredible scryer, and just a deeply spiritual person. And so, kind of growing up in this very, what I would now call kind of Gnostic, um, what sometimes anthropologists have called spiritual church movement style Christianity,
Mm,
in the deep South. Um, so divination wasn't seen as something outside of God. It was seen as a way to be close to God, and to talk, to work with the helpers. It was a tool that oriented towards that. And so so yeah, so it was always part of the conversation about the invisible,
mm,
especially with my mother. So
mm,
the Bible was not contrary to card reading for her. In fact, they often came together. So, so my mother was a huge influence. There were members in my community who were a big influence. And it was something that I was around from an early age, under the influence of my mother and her family in particular. My father, he came from a very Episcopalian family,
Mm.
and so his experience of religion was very different than my mother's experience. And my mother was very, very influenced by her father, my grandfather, who continues to be a very important influence in my life. He died when I was 12. He was a paradoxical man. He was a very complicated man, and he retired from public life in the late 60s and early 70s and withdrew to live the life of a contemplative and an artist, and to adhere to mystical principles. And so a lot of my life was spent we lived with my grandparents on and off, um, and was spent in that environment, which was a very particular environment. Um, and so all of these things kind of came together. um, Christianity, especially the Book of John, which was a beloved favorite of my
Mm.
grandfather, and
The
mystical practices.
How does that start? It's the one that the word is God. Yes.
In the beginning was the word,
Yes. In the
right?
beginning was the word, and the
Right.
word was God. So
Right.
it's still in there.
Yeah. There it is. It's in there. It's
Yeah, it's in there.
haunting the dark chambers of the skull. It's there.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think that's so beautiful because, I mean, if you've heard my interview with Serena, I tell her
Hmm.
that part of what was so like profound for me and hearing you as a tarot reader, someone I'd like literally never met. I only heard through my ears in an audio recording of a tarot reading that you did for me. This like magical synthesis happened that like gave me the first permission I felt like I knew I had to like, I'd already done sort of the grappling with, I think, faith and the mystical and, like sort of what a lot of people would call sort of the newer age arts, which is
Hmm.
interesting because your family's been practicing it for far more than new age things. But, tarot and horoscopes and, like all of those sorts of things, astrology. And like I had done a lot of grappling with that. And I think had come to a place where it felt like all of those things were actually one and the same, and they were all different tools to access the divine, was sort of where I think I had come to. But I think what I hadn't done is reintegrate my southernness.
Hmm. Hmm.
And because I grew up in Texas, and so I had all this, I think, like old stuff I got rid of when I sort of had to disentangle Christianity, that I thought like,
Hmm.
oh, I can't, like, I just couldn't cope with what I had learned
Hmm.
from all of those things. And the South was
Hmm.
so integrated in the faith that I was taught that there was a
Hmm.
period of time where I had to like sort of sift those apart.
Hmm.
And so hearing you and your like southernness and your
Hmm.
cursing and your queerness and the divination and all those things, I was like, ugh, it just feels, oh, there's my cat.
Oh, hi.
Um,
Hello.
oh, hello. Okay,
Mhm.
cool. Well, my little
Cat friendly
divinatory spirit,
space.
yes.
I
Um,
know, right?
yeah, so it
Well,
just felt like an invitation, it was like,
mhm,
oh, or permission, I guess, that I didn't even know I
mhm,
hadn't given myself. And so I guess part of me is also just curious to know your story and like if you started in that place where the Bible and Christianity were part of, like they were sort of part and parcel in the same bucket
mhm,
with Christianity for you. If you ever went through a rupture that had
mhm,
to, or even if it was just like external people critiquing that of you, where you had to grapple with it for yourself,
mhm.
and if you then maybe came to the place where you are now, or if that just felt solid for you the whole time because you had grown up in such an integrated space.
Right. Thank you for that thoughtful question, set of questions, and thank you too for sharing that piece about, you know, what, permission and giving yourself permission, and I mean, just again touching on that theme of multivalence.
Mhm.
The ways that we can integrate our multivalence, our complexity, our contradictions. Um, yeah. Um, so, in terms of my, relationship to Christianity, um, when I would say yes, I have been through ruptures, and I don't identify as a Christian
Mhm.
at this point. And during the pandemic, early on in the pandemic, I made a kind of decision, because I was doing this thing where I have a daughter, I have a 3-year-old, and she is beginning her studies in the divinatory arts this year. And for Christmas, she got her first altar. And, so there's this passing on
Mhm.
of these traditions, and and trying to sort out how the institution of Christianity fits into that, and making the decision that it just doesn't,
Mm.
and just verbalizing that to myself. Now, having said that, you know um the Bible as literature is important to me. Literature that has a sacred dimension, in the sense that stories, um, anyone who tells a story on some level potentially believes in the ability, the possibility of restructuring the heart of the world.
Mm.
And so, but all of which is to say, in terms of where I have felt rupture in my relationship to Christianity, hasn't so much been in the church, because I always existed queerly in the church, in queer church spaces,
Mm.
and you know had a I wasn't raised like my grown up best friend was going over to the Baptist church 3 times a week, and that was not my experience. I would go with her,
Mm.
and but it wasn't my home life. My home life did not reflect that ideology.
Yeah, that's the same
But
for me.
yeah, where my relationship with Christianity has experienced rupture has been in the institution of academics. I
Mm.
started out, I in college, I majored in philosophy of religion, and then went immediately into a master's program, hermeneutics, which, is looking at the Bible as literature, among other things, and theories of interpretation, and the between space of philosophy and God, and then began my dissertation field work for my doctorate, and going through that process.
Mm.
And that, I was excited. I wanted to be a religion scholar. I wanted to be a hermeneutic scholar. I wasn't interested in being ordained, though I did eventually become ordained. And at that time, the ordination of women was very hotly contested. I was going to graduate school in Scotland at the University of Glasgow.
Mm.
And I remember, for example, there was a conference on the Book of Revelations, and scholars from all over the United Kingdom attended. And there was one woman presenter, and she was doing a kind of feminist auto ethnography project, and it was queer, and it was about pussies, and it was about it was incredible. She did this presentation, and I felt seen, and I thought everything
Mm.
is coming together, everything is making sense. I was only one of 2 women in my program. And
Wow.
then directly after her remarkable presentation, which by the way went on to be an incredible book, Tina Pippin, her book, um, Apocalyptic Bodies, The End of the World in Text and Literature, highly recommend. But the presenter after her was this gentleman from Oxford with this incredible kind of CV, who
They
gave
always
a
are.
present, yes, who gave a presentation that was, um, let's just say, um, astonishing for all of the upsetting reasons. And it was also very, very rooted in conspiracy theories and the kind of thing that high-minded academic space would have kind of had some snobbery towards, like, oh, we're more sophisticated than, end time jargon. So at the end of this day of presentations, I was invited into this kind of inner chamber of professors and deans to have some brandy, and it felt like a big deal to be invited into this circle. And the first thing that happened inside that circle was they, in a very emotionally violent way, attacked the presentation of the feminist scholar. And it wasn't just her ideas, right? They attacked
And she
her,
wasn't in the room.
right? No. And I was the only woman in the room.
Wow.
And then they just kind of lightly poked fun at the presenter that came behind her. And in that moment, right, I felt my contract with language break and rupture. And it was about how, Christianity is there's the mystical Gnostic experience, but there's the institution. And so I had to reckon with the institution of Christianity inside the institution of academics. And so for me, that is where a significant rupture happened that changed the course of my theoretical interest and inquiry, and initiated me into new corners of my own feminist agency, and so on.
Yeah, so much came up for me there. I think part of this work for me also is, in turn, also a gift of hopefully helping other people feel seen and permission giving, where I go, oh, you don't have to only be this thing. You get to be this plus that, plus that, plus that, that's going. I hope what I'm doing is just like being a living model of what it looks to hold all of that complication in a way that I feel like you hearing her and me hearing you is sort of a lineage of people going like, here's your permission. Like, you don't have to fit inside the institution. And as Serena also said, like, your story doesn't have to be clean. And also maybe I don't want in that circle, like I've been told that this is the important circle, but maybe I actually don't want to be in that circle. And that queerness often is the place, like the rhizome, that's finding a way to live in the margin and thrive in the margin. And even also just the cards you pulled, the Knight of Wands, right? And the Six of Pentacles. And there was something you said about not allowing the institution to, I forget how you phrased it, but like dictate.
Right. Not to ally with the institution's request that you diminish yourself. And, I also want to acknowledge that that's not possible for everyone. That people are working inside of institutions and for a range of reasons and can be very disempowered. So I want to add that caveat that that piece is also real. And just thinking of this podcast, like the mishmash, like I think that the universe loves the tool of juxtaposition. And when you bring something together with something else, it generates an energy that creates a space. And there's always the potential that what will emerge from that space will lead to a new paradigm that will help us save our asses, So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's go ahead.
I was just going to say that moment, in that inner chamber, it was this shocking moment of feeling finally like, here's a person I can identify with, and also seeing her being, it felt like this moment of this ancient, like my cells remembered this ancient witch hunt feeling, like she was, tried as a hysteric and her ideas were put to death in this inner circle of brandy drinking gentlemen, and so it was like, okay, it was like a rope drop down, and I was like, I'm going to climb out of here. This is, and of course it wasn't that simple, and it's not that simple, but anyway.
No, but I think that's the part, I think, to me, that's so, I think, aligned with the act of writing and divination, right? Is that whether or not you see yourself as a diviner, like if you're one of those things that, like, there is a way that when you have experienced rupture, or you've seen where things get mishmashed and that one
Mhm.
side is sort of critiquing the other, that you in that space can work from a place of going like, ooh, I actually see that growth for me and growth for us, maybe as a collective, is actually finding a space where we can hold both of those things. But to your point, there is also, I think for me, there's been growth in going, okay, where is the institution useful? Like,
Mhm.
and also that, like, not everyone can work outside of the institution. Sometimes working
Right.
in the institution is where we sort of have to
Mhm.
work.
Right.
I hesitate to use
Absolutely.
the word have to, but like there is a part
Mhm.
of it that's like institution is often what we're presented as our range of opportunities. And so how do you work within academia? How do you work within the
Mhm.
church? How do you work within even
Right.
the institution of divining, that like really anything
Mhm.
can become an institution. So even
Mhm.
if you've been in just like purely divination spaces and you went, whoa, I don't,
Mhm.
that's actually not totally what I believe.
Mhm.
But from that space, like that, I think those ruptures are often like what sort of move us forward, both as
Mhm.
individuals and as a collective. And that in writing, you are actually practicing an act of like prophetic gifting, like that. I've always thought sci-fi, especially, of course, is like sort of speaking toward a vision of the future that you see as possible, and writing in
Mhm.
general as a way to, yeah, construct a new world that you don't yet see, I guess.
Right. I mean, gosh, so much comes up for me hearing you speak. It's so wonderful, actually, to hear you speak. There's so many networks of thinking. The rupture. What ruptures. No need to minimize the uncomfort or the pain
Mm-hmm.
of a rupture, right? And and right, because the rupture delivers us, into a spectrum space rather than it releases us from the binary. It has
Mm-hmm.
the power to release us from binary consciousness and enter the zone of the a spectrum-based consciousness, right? And that is that's a powerful experience that can enable us to hold and project our multivalence, to be multivalent beings, to
Mm-hmm.
hold that. Um, so, I think, yeah, rupturing is powerful, right? It
Mm-hmm.
can it can do all of those things, and it can really hurt and give us opportunities to be initiated into the difficult lessons of loss. It can do both of those
Mm-hmm.
things.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, sort of hopping somewhere else too, also, because I just selfishly, I think, want to hear you talk about bibliomancy. I just want to hear you riff on it. Mostly, so in Divinatory Poetics, you say being an effective reader is contingent upon the quality of presence with which one positions oneself in the constant stream of information and texts. And that stream is wherever you are all the time, in every grand place and in every suffering pit, which is just beautiful in and of itself. But I think some of what you said too, I feel like the ability, someone I follow a lot, I guess, in my life, Rob Bell, who I always refer to, but never directly say his name out loud, because it's again sort of a reference to my old Christian days.
Hmm.
And people have very strong feelings about Rob Bell. And so it's like
Hmm.
publicly hard for me to talk about without giving you 6 hours of commentary about.
I
But
understand. Hmm.
yeah, nonetheless, I've always loved part of what he said. I feel, I mean, number one, his first book called Velvet Elvis, the first chapter was called Questions. So automatically, he's just someone I know that is like,
Hmm.
here we are. I'm out of the gate. I'm telling you, this entire thing is about questions.
Hmm.
But was also someone for me who was the first person who went like, you can claim truth wherever you see it.
Hmm.
And in being in Christianity at that time, I was like, what? That feels wild, like a wild
Hmm.
concept to me. Like I've been told there's only one way of
Hmm.
truth, but in my lived experience, I'd be reading other things or listening to other things, And even like you said, even reading the Bible in some ways is like it's a different kind of tool where you're reading it and there's some sort of divining that's happening from it. And so I love this idea of sort of thinking about divining as just kind of existing, that it's like in every place you go all the time, just the posture where you're present to what's happening, that you call reading the tarot, but it's also reading the Bible, which is also reading the spoons that fell on the floor, which is reading what happened outside today, which is listening to the news, which is, like there just sort of goes on. And that in some way there is an ability to engage with life from a posture of like everything is data, and everything might also be a message for me. So like, how do I take that in and interpret that? And then, what would my reading be? What would my writing say out of that? Which is all kind of a form of bibliomancy if you're only talking at least about reading texts. But I think that engaging with the world in that way is just such a more fascinating, it's a more alive place for me to go, like everything might be speaking to me.
Yes.
What am I hearing?
I love, I mean, I resonate so much with what you've said. And I think because it centers, among other things, curiosity. And curiosity and wonder very much can put us in contact with the sensation of what, aliveness. We're engaged, so suddenly we're stitched into the body suit, and then it becomes, how can I be a better engager? And it kind of goes to this point that you mentioned about the quality of presence. And I think this is true with writing and divining. Writing, we sometimes think of it as this privatized act that happens at our desk. And yes, that's also true. But it's a type of awareness you practice in the world, and I love, thinking of C.D. Wright a lot lately. But she was asked in a Poets and Writers interview, like, oh my God, I don't even know, early 90s maybe. But was asked, like, how do you keep writing better and better books? Fair question. And her response was, it's not about writing better, it's about seeing better. It's about, and seeing and being a seer, one who, engages with the divinatory realms here, really kind of meet for me. So the quality of one's presence when you're writing, when you're reading cards, when you're walking to the 7-Eleven and noticing found text and trash, it's a way of listening. It's a way of having an ear to the multivalence of the multiple nervous systems that constitute the ecology in which you're moving through. It's a way to be in a loop of engagement, to cultivate that type of awareness. And so, yeah, bibliomancy as like a mode of being, I love it. I love the idea that it's not just this activity, but it's a posture. And it's one that is collaborative. It's one that depends on listening, and interpreting. The act of interpretation acquires the potential sacred resonance. And but one final thing I just wanted to mention, this idea, you brought up the moment from the book where it talks about, like, being connected in a sense, like wherever you are, whether that's in a fancy place or in the suffering pits. And I want to really hear genuflect to people like Edie Hilsom. And I'm always like rooting for a revival of her work. She was a writer and a journalist who died in Auschwitz. A very, very interesting woman and thinker. And her book, there's several books. I Interrupted Life and The Letters from Westerbork, or the two. I think they're published as a couplet now. But she knew that she was going into a space of death, and her goal was to try to be, as an experiment, even to be a font of love amidst the charnel grounds. And I've always thought, like, yeah, if I had a goal, that would be my goal. And it feels like the goal of the work of divination and writing as well, right?
Love, in short.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I sort of brought up, there's some cliche quote. I think it's Thoreau who said something like, I'm going to get it somewhat wrong, but the closest I remember is something to the effect of uh, how arrogant it would be for me to sit down to write when I've not stood up to live.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, I think I also, even in talking with Julianne, who's a writer as well, our mutual friend,
mhm,
um, I think sometimes you'll hear us and talking about the act of creativity and doing creative work in the world, sort of go like, oh my God, what if we run out of ideas? Like what
mhm,
happens if I like sit down and I don't know what to write? And
mhm,
I think so often my reframe is actually like, that my job is not writing. It's sort of a way of saying it's paying attention.
mhm,
But really, I think for me, I sort of frame that as gratitude. Like if I'm centered on curiosity and gratitude and wonder and connection to this like brilliant, beautiful, wild, regenerative force that lies behind the world, that like naturally, like if my job is to be connected to that, something's going to come through, you know. Um,
right.
And so for me, it is sort of a consistent act of being engaged and present and connected to that source,
Mhm.
however that source is showing up for me at any particular moment. And that, yeah, my job is more so to be like a channel, right? So it's more like tuning in to whatever it is that's going on in the world. And so if I look at that either as prayer or reading or being with friends or cooking dinner or gardening or any of that, like to me those are all sources of being connected to the divine. It's why I get really, you'll see me get kind of furious anytime I actually went to a church service for the first time in as long as I can remember, a couple weekends ago. And there was some commentary in it that was sort of like, and I'm not going to do it justice, it was more beautiful and complicated than this, but there was at least one part where someone was sort of making a reference that is an old trigger for me, which is sort of like, well, God is only inside of this building, or
Mhm,
like this idea that God only exists in holy places.
mhm,
And I'm like,
right.
what the actual fuck are you talking about? I experience
Yeah.
God everywhere I go, and I don't know what sort
Mhm,
of arrogant belief I must have in order to think that I'm the one who brings God to other people. Like God is in every, like you say, suffering pit and
mhm,
grand place, and in my garden, and that
mhm.
no one also has the right to sort of, I guess like, maybe this is like Christian philosophical thought or like some sort of rabbinical something, but like, I guess like Old Testament, there were people who kept you, like who were
Mhm,
sort of the gatekeepers of God. Like you
mhm,
can or cannot
mhm,
experience someone inside, him inside the tabernacle sort of thing.
mhm.
But like
Right.
once Jesus comes along, then it's like, oh no, like everyone gets to access this.
Mhm,
Um, and so yeah, I think there's just a part of me that's like, I understand and respect elders, that there are people who actually we should trust and listen to, who have experience and have like a lifetime or lifetimes of wisdom. And it takes a lot of discernment practice to understand who those people should be for you. But anytime I think I see a church talking about God as though God is only accessible in certain places or is with certain people, I get kind of inflamed.
oh yeah, it's infuriating and absolutely. And and that's the thing about the institution of Christianity is one of its strategies is to control access to God, right?
Right.
It benefits from mediating and managing the space between you and God. And you can see that when Christianity really becomes an institution, you really begin to see this around the third century, right? And then of course again in the sixth century and really just from that point on. And it comes with how the canonization of the New Testament is formed. Out of many testaments in rotation, that these particular testaments were selected to reinforce a political agenda, right? That invoked the idea of unification, um, at the expense of multivalence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the mystical possibility that is always present in when multivalence is pulsing. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, this idea that God is only in one place, it's God is wherever you are. God is where you talk to God. And I think that that's really what the cards are about for me. It's like they're just like about talking to the invisible. And it can happen wherever you are. And it can happen even if you don't have cards.
Mm-hmm.
you
Right.
know?
Yeah, I love that the pieces in Divinatory Poetics where you talk about, here I wrote with spit and here with tobacco and
Hmm.
here I prayed with this and here nothing, like
Right.
that sometimes there are tools that help us access that, but also if
Hmm.
you don't have anything but yourself, that you've got as much access as you need, sort of
Hmm.
thing. There's something you said though a second ago too, is talking about like how those messages show up in your body. So I also sort of wanted to talk about like, is you have a thing around like archive in the somatics, like how
Mm.
tarot is sort of an archive, and yeah, how do those things intersect with you and tarot and reading and bodies?
Oh gosh, such a wonderful question. Thank you. Um, I mean, I kind of am fond of talking about any given tarot card as an archive, right? And it's an archive, like, say, for example, you have the Fool, zero, the number zero in the deck, right, of the major
Mm-hmm.
arcana, right? The Fool. It's like imagine going through a portal or a door, and above it, there's a mantle that says the Fool, right? It's this archetype. But once you go through that portal, you're not just in a library. You're in a network of archives, and all of those archives are underlit by catacombs, you know, and their secret hatches, right? So you can wander around in any given, you know, archive of any given tarot card for a very long time and never exhaust the possibilities for wisdom and reflection um, on the general animating principle of that card, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's a place, and so that are the archive or the network of archives that is held, you know, in the portal of the tarot card meets the archive of your body, right?
Mm.
Which is this multivalent series of networks and knowledges and multitudes and so on. So you have these two archives meeting, like this plus that, right? You have a juxtaposition. That juxtaposition, creates a unique temporary temple space or zone where things can be, kind of can emerge. And as Kathleen Stewart talks about, um, animated strands of animated potential
Mm.
emerging from these temporary spaces we craft through our engagement, through our juxtapositionings, as it were. So I don't know, those are some thoughts towards the archive and divination. I'm
Yeah,
not
I
sure if it totally, yeah.
no, I that was perfect. I mean, I it brings up for me, I think again, sort of that idea of aliveness, that there's no sort of simple answers, and that every time a space changes where there's different people in it or a different card is pulled or whatever, there's just like a constant aliveness, that a new story or a new possibility is presented that would not have been there if the circumstances were different.
Mm-hmm.
And also, our bodies as archives, I think, is a fascinating way to think about your own body. I think one of the things
Mm-hmm.
that you said to me in my tarot reading was also like healing happens in all directions, meaning that
Mm-hmm.
when we do work today, that also in time, the archive of our bodies like is actually helping to
Mm-hmm.
heal generational wounds and trauma forward
Mm-hmm.
and backward.
Mm-hmm.
And even me, I mean, I've done like a lot of my stuff and sort of story engages with like health and or I guess like chronic illness is the better way to put that.
Mm-hmm.
And also especially because I'm such a nerd about fermentation that I've been studying the gut and the gut microbiome for a while, and like have started to look at like your gut is literally an archive. Like you
Mm-hmm.
inherit the gut of your ancestors, And so your
Mm-hmm.
body is literally an archive of their microbiome, of their parents and their parents before them. And, all the things that we're starting to realize about the connection between your gut and your brain and even your personality, right? So like that you are like in all times constantly living with generational things inside you that inform your personality and your illness and the way that you see the world. And also that our biomes are affected constantly by everything we're around, the toxins we're
Mm-hmm.
breathing in, the people we're with, the food we're eating. And so there is this constant maybe addition to the archive. We're constantly
Mm-hmm.
adding to the archive of what
Mm-hmm.
our biome is made up of. And so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, our bodies are constant, yeah, just networks and
Mm-hmm.
stores of information that are just like
Oh,
lineages
yeah,
of thought and faith, or um yeah, southernness, or
absolutely.
yeah, all those things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all, it's all in there, I mean, I think I had significant dental surgery at the very beginning of the pandemic, right before the pandemic. And it's amazing that I learned a lot about teeth through this experience, and it's similar in similar ways that
Mm,
you were speaking about gut brain loop, that loop and
mhm,
that health, and how
mhm,
it connects us to our ancestors and future descendants, right?
mhm,
In our teeth, every trace of every toxin that has ever entered our body is archived in our teeth,
mm,
you know and just our structural alignment, that misadjustments, right,
mhm,
um, form their own little chambers inside the archive of our spinal network, where certain wounds are remembered or marked,
mhm,
right? And
mhm,
it is a living space, as you say. It's always shifting and changing and accommodating new sensation, new information. It's affected by its environment. So it's like the archive is a place. It's such an incredible paradigm, because it's it's um, it's also collaborative. It's
mhm.
also responsive. It responds back. There's a call and response, you know,
Say
at the
poet.
kind of, yeah, right at the heart of the archive. So it's an amazing paradigm,
Yeah.
and the body as an archive, certainly.
So funny. This is a totally unplanned tangent, but actually my chronic illness has led me to dental stuff.
Hmm.
Literally, like I am in the middle of dental things. Um, Mostly, I'm about to do dental cavitation surgery,
Hmm.
and I don't know if you know anything about dental cavitation surgery, um, but I am learning that I have lived with infection in my gums and jaw for years that
Hmm.
have been streaming straight into my
Hmm.
bloodstream, because that's how your mouth works.
Yeah.
And all these years of trying to untangle chronic illness and realizing that like a lot of it actually lived in my mouth, and I had like lived
Hmm.
a life like most of us where our mouth was disconnected from the rest of our health.
Hmm.
And yeah, that even just the work I've been doing studying, so where I'm having the cavitation surgery is my wisdom teeth. So where all of my
Hmm.
wisdom teeth were pulled, there's infection, and that happens in
Hmm.
most people who get their wisdom teeth taken out,
Hmm.
by the way. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, and that your wisdom teeth are energetically connected to your thyroid, your heart, and your small intestine. And I was like, great, you've just described literally every chronic illness I've ever had,
Wow,
or
amazing.
many of them.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I don't think it describes everything, because that would be a little too simple for the way that health works.
Right.
But
Right.
there's still so much that, like, yeah, just thinking about, and I just interviewed Charles Eisenstein with my friend Lauren Buckley. And I think that will come out before our talk here airs. But um, yeah, just I think in our conversation and otherwise, like talking about the weird connection between not just your teeth and the rest of your organs, but even spiritually, like
Hmm.
misalignments spiritually and
Hmm.
how those show up in
Hmm.
your body physically.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, there's to me so many connections there between like, yeah, just like in the
Yeah.
center of that flux around dental things and how it affects my health, and also like the reflections that I'm having spiritually. And um,
Hmm.
yeah, maybe what even those organs say about yeah, just the spiritual connections between each of your organs and how, like, oh, if you can't process sugar the right way, this is part of what I talk about with Charles and Lauren, then what does that say spiritually about your ability to engage with the deliciousness of life? Like the metaphor of how that actually gets lived out externally also. But anyway.
Well, I feel you in your teeth, your journey, your trajectory of healing with your teeth, and having been on that trajectory myself, continued, and having had that surgery, significant surgeries, it is so intensely emotional when we begin to address and heal teeth trauma. And there's so many poverty paradigms stored in our teeth. There's so much sadness. And it is a place to talk to our ancestors, that's for sure, and our descendants, right? It's an incredible trajectory, that healing trajectory. So I admire that you're on that trajectory.
Yeah, thanks.
It's not easy, not for the faint of heart.
No, but I mean, when you did a reading for me, and I feel like in general, when you talk about folks who are diviners, that the crossroads is, like that quote before, sort of where we live, and the crossroads you said in my reading was not for the faint of heart. It's this is, it's not a circle, it's a crossroads. You make a decision there and you move forward into a new story. And so, yeah, there's a lot for that, or in that and around that for me, about this is me choosing a new story, so yeah, it just, then gets interpreted into my experience, and I write about it, and, it becomes a part of the sort of living text. Right.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah. But yes, not easy.
No.
Is there anything else we didn't cover that you'd love to talk about?
Gosh, we've covered so much territory, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak about these things. And there's nothing like the gift of a good question, and you're very excellent at giving that gift. So thank you for these questions. It's been a real delight and privilege to think about these things today. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. I'm so excited to actually finally get to talk to you.
I know.
We have
I know.
like so many, like, these friends are your friends and these other friends are my friends, and they're all friends together, but we've never actually gotten to talk one-on-one. So it's nice to be able to do that. What was I was gonna shoot. You just said something that came up. Oh, I've even like, I've always found, this is totally non sequitur, but I always found the story of Jacob and Israel, like Jacob running into God and falling into a trance in a dream, and then wrestling with God and being given a new name, like that. What a powerful story also to engage with, that like, yeah, there is a wrestle. And I've always, one of the things I've written about in the past is that I heard at one point, I think it was actually through Rob Bell, that in Jewish culture, it was a compliment to tell someone that they had a limp, because it meant they had wrestled with God in the desert. And so there was some sort of like ancient phrase that used to sort of go like, oh, like you've got a limp, like there's like, sort of like much respect to you, sort of like a thorn in your side, like we can see that there's something there and you've wrestled with that question. So yeah, I think there's a sacredness about wrestling with questions that is an engagement with the divine.
Absolutely. In praise of difficulty over here. It's not for the faint of heart, is also an invitation to have a filterless, this idea we talked about earlier, filterless engagement with how spirit is showing up. And sometimes spirit shows up as nothing, and sometimes as something terrifying and uncanny, and sometimes something that's familiar and delightful, and so how are we going to participate? How are we going to show up? That guiding question.
Yeah. And hopefully for me, my growth is like also believing that comes in joy too, and not just the suffering pit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely joy. And I think joy is one of those things that a lot of times people equate or confuse with happiness.
Right.
And I think it's actually a different type of texture, and it can handle nuance and complexity. And so absolutely not
Yeah.
not just the suffering, right? It's not either or, it's and,
Right.
you know.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I love that bit in Divinatory Poetics where you talk about celebration, that so many people have a hard time holding celebration because you think it's forgetting the grief or the loss or, the suffering or whatever that is. But it is actually a both and, that it's,
Hmm.
yes, this is happening. And I get to celebrate that there's been progress or there's been insight
Hmm.
or, what, the beauty and the necessity, I guess, of ritual, and actually also ritualizing our joy and our, like, yeah,
Hmm.
celebration.
Yes.
Speaking of joy and celebration, you just recently released a book, correct? Called Rancher.
Yes,
Yeah. What's
yes.
that about?
It's really about healing and community, and how healing happens in community. It's about surprising resurrections. As someone from that I thought was dead, it turned out they just had moved to El Paso, Texas, and so just the surprise, like,
There's a
oh,
Texas joke in there
I had like
somewhere.
imagined your funeral. Oh yes, yes. So just unexpected resurrections and
Mm,
the healing that is possible from the rupture that can create.
mm,
And so it's a story about sexual assault and integration. It's also a story about um, our invisible friends that help us out, the saints and the ghosts that we meet along the way, and about the real life friendships and communities that kind of weave together a vessel inside of which we can rupture in the name of our own healing, to kind of again invoke what you said at the beginning of our chat today, the
mm.
Camille Roy quote about narrative providing a context that the rupturing of identity can become visible. The
Yeah.
community can hold that space as well in terms of our healing. So it's about those things in a nutshell.
Yeah. Do you have anything else coming out or to speak about toward the beginning of the year?
I'm finishing a novel
Ooh.
and moving towards also a collection of essays. And so I'm drafting one right now, which is very much about grace, this idea of
Mm.
grace and grace's connection to suicide. And so
Whoa.
how do you bring together that? What happens when you put this plus that, when that's the this and that's the that, right? And so
Yeah.
I'm very much in the flow of writing. I wish that I could just like write and write and write and write, read and read and read and read.
Don't we
Um,
all? Yeah.
I know there's a lot of energy for that type of work right now. For me, it's really, I'm appreciating it. But
Yeah.
so hoping to finish some books in the new year.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. I just keep sort of putting it out in the universe that one of my sincere hopes is in the near future to interview Adrienne Marie Brown, so we
Oh
can
yes.
talk about the intersections of pleasure plus grief, because she spent
Hmm.
a lot of time in the recent past ish talking about pleasure, but now is writing
Hmm.
about grief.
Yes.
So yeah, I really want to talk to her about those things because I think that would be fascinating.
I would love to listen to that conversation. I cannot
So
wait.
would I. Yes. So yes, I'm believing that will happen at some point. Um, but yeah, thank you for your time and for, I don't know. I said to Lincoln Carr, I don't know if you know Lincoln Carr. He's a professor at, he teaches with Shannon in a similar department, at least, another mutual friend that we have. And yeah, toward the end of that conversation with him, I just said, like, to me, this is also one, I don't know. I think Rob also talks about Judaism as a, like, the sort of a lineage of like chewing stuff over. Like you speak it out loud because you're like trying to chew things over. And I sort of see these conversations as this like mystical way to continue a lineage of chewing over these questions and yeah, the new ideas that come from them, and then sharing those forward. And other people get to come and listen to this and then create their own things out of it. And I think that's a method of divining and creation that are really fascinating to me. Um, but I think just to close out, I was just remembering you did two divinations for me, two recordings. One was longer and then the other one was shorter, sort of a follow up to the first one. And I think months ago now, it was after I'd already decided to start this podcast. But before I had launched it, I was traveling to the mountains with I was on my way to meet a friend to go camping in the mountains, and I hadn't listened to the second divination in a while. And so on my drive there, I turned it on, and I had completely forgotten about this part in it where you say something to the effect of, I think, Brandi, like what you're trying to work out is sort of like this generational trauma. And the thing that will sort of help you heal that is creating a container where all these disparate things can be held. And I nearly stopped the car because I just started instantly weeping because I was like, I didn't even remember that she basically forecasted my podcast. But this is for me, like the container I created to be able to hold all of those disparate things. And I was like, oh my God, I'm doing my own generational healing. And I had in part thought about it that way, but
that's so cool. Thank you for sharing. That's really cool and really beautiful. And you absolutely are. I'm a fan of the podcast. I think I've listened to all but the most recent episode that was very recently released. And it's like when these questions, you alchemize these questions with your own nuances, with your own interiority, and then you generously bring others into that experience. And it generates new thinking, which could create new strategies, which could help us figure out how to keep staying in these bodies amidst this complexity that truly needs creative thinking. That is what is needed in the times to come. Next level creative thinking. So it's healing in all directions. So cool.
Yeah, I hope so. But I just just to cheesily thank you for what a gift those divinations were to me. You genuinely have some sort of wild mystical connection to the divine that is special, and I'm just in consistent awe of, and I love just hearing all of your work and tuning into all of it, and also the people that you've also had even in your classes that then, like Serena, that like reflect back to me, like how they carry that forward. So yeah, it's just been a gift to also be in your work. So thank you for being here and having the conversation. It's such a pleasure to finally get to do it one-on-one.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. And I just thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been great to hang out and chat about these things with you today.
Absolutely.
For sure.
I hope it's only the beginning, for sure.
Yes. Oh, yes. It feels like a continuation, actually, of a
Yes.
conversation that's been going on in these other iterations. So for sure.
Absolutely.